Did you know that the fisherman who became Christianity's foundation may never have set foot in Rome? What if the rock upon which the church was built has a history far more complex than tradition claims? And why do archaeological discoveries keep challenging everything we thought we knew about St. Peter? Before we begin this journey, understand that for 2,000 years, we've been told a clear story about St. Peter, the simple fisherman chosen by Jesus, the first pope, the martyr crucified upside down in Rome, buried beneath the Vatican. The Church has built its entire authority structure on Peter's supposed leadership and Roman presence. But what if that narrative is partly legend, partly politics, and only partly history? Today, we're going to separate archaeological evidence from pious tradition, examining what we actually know about the man called Simon Peter and what remains frustratingly mysterious. Let's start with what the earliest sources actually tell us. Simon, later called Peter, meaning rock in Greek, was a fisherman from Bethsaida, a village on the Sea of Galilee. He appears in all four Gospels as one of Jesus' closest disciples, along with his brother Andrew. The Gospel of Matthew, written approximately between 70 and 90 CE, records Jesus telling Simon, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." This single verse has justified papal authority for 2 millennia. But examine the historical evidence beyond Scripture, and the picture becomes murky. The earliest extra-biblical reference to Peter comes from Clement of Rome, writing around 96 CE. Clement mentions Peter's martyrdom, but provides no specific details about location or method. The historian Eusebius, writing in the early 4th century, claims Peter was crucified in Rome under Nero's persecution around 64 CE. But Eusebius was writing nearly 300 years after the supposed event, relying on traditions that had passed through generations. In 1939, workers excavating beneath St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City discovered an ancient Roman necropolis, a city of the dead. Pope Pius XII authorized systematic archaeological investigation. Between 1940 and 1949, researchers led by archaeologists Margherita Garducci and Antonio Ferrua uncovered a complex of tombs dating from the 1st through 4th centuries CE. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that Peter's bones had been identified among the excavated remains. But modern forensic analysis tells a more complicated story. Examinations conducted in the 1970s and reanalyzed with advanced techniques in 2013 revealed that the bones belonged to multiple individuals of different ages and genders. Some were clearly not 1st century. The identification of Peter's actual remains remains contested among scholars, though the Vatican maintains its claim. To understand the Peter question, you need to grasp the political and theological stakes involved. Peter's presence in Rome isn't just historical curiosity, it's the foundation of papal legitimacy. Imagine the early Christian world in the decades after Jesus' death around 30 CE. Christianity was a small Jewish sect, one of many competing for followers in the Roman Empire. Different communities claimed authority through different apostles. Jerusalem Christians followed James, Jesus' brother. Antioch claimed Peter and Paul. Alexandria had its own traditions. Rome needed apostolic credentials to claim leadership over this fractured movement. The doctrine of apostolic succession holds that bishops derive their authority through an unbroken chain back to the apostles. For Rome to claim supremacy over all Christianity, it needed to prove that Peter, whom Jesus had designated as the Rock, had served as Rome's first bishop and died there. Without Peter in Rome, Rome's claim to lead Christianity collapses. This isn't just theology, its politics dressed in religious language. Now consider this moment. What if Peter never actually went to Rome? What if he remained primarily in Jerusalem, leading the Jewish Christian community there while Paul evangelized to Gentiles? Early Christian texts show tension between Peter and Paul over whether converts needed to follow Jewish law. The book of Galatians describes Paul publicly confronting Peter in Antioch over this issue. This doesn't sound like Peter held unchallenged authority. Some scholars now suggest that the tradition of Peter in Rome emerged gradually, solidifying only in the 2nd century as Roman Christianity sought to establish its primacy. The Gospel of Matthew, written in Syria, emphasizes Peter's leadership. But the Gospel of Mark, possibly written in Rome, shows Peter making mistakes, denying Jesus, requiring correction. Different communities had different Peters, shaped by local needs and conflicts. The worldview that created St. Peter, as we know him, wasn't 1st century history. It was 2nd and 3rd century theology. Church fathers needed a narrative that justified Rome's growing power. Peter became that narrative. The simple fisherman was transformed into the first pope, his story embellished with details that served institutional needs rather than historical accuracy. This doesn't mean Peter was unimportant or fictional. It means that separating the historical person from the theological construct is extraordinarily difficult. Every source we have was written by people with theological agendas. Even the Gospels, our earliest sources, were composed decades after Jesus' death by authors who never met him or Peter. We're trying to see through layers of interpretation, translation, and institutional interest to glimpse a man who lived 2,000 years ago. What physical evidence exists for Peter's life and death? The archaeological record is frustratingly sparse but tantalizing. The excavations beneath St. Peter's Basilica revealed not just tombs but graffiti. Ancient pilgrims had scratched messages on the walls. "Peter, pray for us! Peter is within." Carbon dating places some of these inscriptions to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. This proves that by 200 CE, Christians believed Peter was buried in that location. But belief isn't evidence of actual burial. In 2023, researchers using ground-penetrating radar technology examined the site more thoroughly. Their findings, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, suggest that the tomb designated as Peter's was indeed a focus of veneration from at least 150 CE. But whether that veneration was based on actual burial or early tradition remains unresolved. The physical evidence for Peter's crucifixion is even weaker. Roman records of Nero's persecution mention Christians being executed, but no names survive. The tradition that Peter was crucified upside down appears first in the Acts of Peter, a 2nd century apocryphal text filled with legendary material. The story claims Peter requested inverted crucifixion because he felt unworthy to die as Jesus did. It's a beautiful story, but is it history? Modern forensic analysis has examined crucifixion methods. The bones supposedly identified as Peter's show no evidence of crucifixion trauma. No nail marks, no characteristic bone damage. This doesn't disprove the tradition, as not all crucifixion victims show skeletal trauma. But it removes what could have been compelling physical evidence. The most solid physical evidence for Peter's existence comes not from Rome, but from Galilee. Archaeological excavations at Capernaum, begun in 1968, uncovered a house church built over 1st century foundations. Early Christian graffiti identifies it as Peter's house, and the structure shows continuous Christian veneration from the 1st century onward. This, at least, suggests Peter was a real person from Capernaum, as the Gospels claim. But understanding the historical, Peter requires grasping the psychological transformation he supposedly underwent from impulsive fisherman to foundational church leader. How did this happen, if it happened at all? The gospel portraits show Peter as temperamental and inconsistent. He walks on water but then doubts and sinks. He declares Jesus the Messiah, but then rebukes Jesus for predicting his death. He swears absolute loyalty, but then denies knowing Jesus 3 times. This is either remarkably honest historical memory or deliberate theological construction, showing that even flawed people can become saints. Now consider this moment when Peter supposedly encountered the resurrected Jesus, described in John's Gospel. Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" mirroring Peter's 3 denials. Peter affirms his love each time, and Jesus commands him to feed my sheep. This scene, whether historical or literary, represents psychological restoration. Peter's guilt is addressed, his commitment renewed, his mission clarified. Some researchers believe this narrative reflects real psychological transformation common in religious conversion experiences. Modern psychology recognizes that profound guilt can motivate dramatic behavioral change. If Peter genuinely believed he'd betrayed his teacher, then encountered what he interpreted as that teacher resurrected, the psychological impact would be enormous. Guilt, relief, renewed purpose. These could transform someone's entire personality. But there's another psychological dimension to consider. The construction of Peter as the reliable rock served early Christian needs for stable authority. Christianity needed leaders who wouldn't waver under persecution. By transforming Peter from denier to martyr, the tradition created a model of redemption. Anyone could overcome failure and become faithful. This psychological message was powerful for persecuted communities. The mental techniques Peter supposedly employed in his later leadership appear in Acts of the Apostles, written by Luke probably between 80 and 90 CE. Peter is shown as decisive, performing miracles, making authoritative pronouncements at the Council of Jerusalem. This is leadership psychology, projecting confidence, claiming divine authority, using rhetoric to persuade. Whether the historical Peter actually possessed these skills or Luke attributed them to enhance Peter's authority, we cannot know. Letters attributed to Peter. 1 Peter and 2 Peter in the New Testament show sophisticated Greek composition unlikely from a Galilean fisherman. Most scholars believe these were written by educated Christians using Peter's name to give their letters apostolic authority. This was common practice in the ancient world, not considered forgery but honoring a revered figure. Yet it means we have no direct access to Peter's actual thoughts or mental techniques. The psychological reality we can establish is this: early Christians needed Peter to be the rock. Whether he was that rock in reality or became that rock through collective memory and theological necessity, the need shaped the tradition. The mental techniques attributed to Peter reflect what early Christians valued: courage under persecution, willingness to suffer for faith, authority to settle disputes, ability to transform from failure to faithfulness. This doesn't mean Peter was fiction. It means the Peter we can access through historical sources is already interpreted Peter, already shaped by the needs and imaginations of the communities that remembered him. And here's where the Peter story becomes truly fascinating and deeply complicated. Because the moment Christianity became Rome's official religion under Constantine in the early 4th century, Peter's story became frozen in imperial politics. In 324 CE, Constantine ordered construction of a basilica over the supposed site of Peter's tomb. This wasn't just pious devotion, it was political strategy. By claiming Peter for Rome, Constantine was claiming Christianity's foundational authority for his capital. The basilica made physical and permanent what had been tradition and claim. Pilgrims came. Legends grew. The site became too important to question. But examine the architectural structure of what Constantine built, and you'll see something revealing. He constructed the basilica over an active cemetery, requiring massive earthworks to level the site. Why go to such effort and expense? Either because genuine tradition identified this as Peter's burial place, or because Constantine needed to establish Rome's Christian credentials, and this site served that purpose. Modern archaeology cannot definitively distinguish between these possibilities. The cosmic alignment of evidence and politics becomes clear when examining how Peter's story evolved in church councils. The Council of Nicaea in 325, convened by Constantine, didn't discuss Peter specifically. It focused on defining Christ's nature. But subsequent councils used Peter's supposed authority to justify Rome's bishops claiming leadership over other churches. By 445, Pope Leo I was explicitly arguing that he inherited Peter's authority directly, that he was Peter's successor, not just leader of Rome's Christian community. Now consider this moment in 1968 when Pope Paul VI announced Peter's bones had been identified. The Vatican had been excavating for nearly 30 years. Modern scientific methods were available, yet the announcement came with theological certainty that outpaced scientific evidence. Archaeologist Antonio Ferrua, who participated in the excavations, remained skeptical of the bone identification until his death. His colleague, Margherita Garducci, insisted the bones were authentic. The disagreement wasn't just scholarly, it represented tension between archaeological evidence and institutional need for certainty. Recent research has added another layer of complexity. In 2013, a team of Italian researchers published findings suggesting that the tomb beneath St. Peter's Basilica might originally have honored a different martyr entirely, with Peter's association added later. Their evidence included analysis of the tomb's construction sequence and the dates of surrounding burials. The study was controversial and disputed, but it illustrates how archaeological science continues challenging established traditions. The most devastating revelation isn't about whether Peter reached Rome, it's about the gap between what we can know and what institutions claim to know. The Catholic Church requires papal authority to function. That authority derives from Peter. Therefore, Peter must have been in Rome, must have led the Church there, must be buried beneath the Vatican. The conclusion is predetermined. Evidence is interpreted to support it. But here's what we can say with reasonable historical confidence. A fisherman named Simon from Galilee became a follower of Jesus. He was prominent among early disciples. He experienced something after Jesus' death that he interpreted as resurrection. He became a leader in the Jerusalem Christian community. He had conflicts with Paul over how Christianity should relate to Judaism. He was martyred, probably during Nero's persecution, though whether in Rome or elsewhere remains uncertain. Early Christians venerated his memory. By the 2nd century, Roman Christians claimed he died and was buried in Rome. This claim became foundational to Rome's authority over Christianity. Everything else, the inverted crucifixion, the specific tomb location, the direct line of succession to modern popes, ranges from plausible tradition to later embellishment to outright legend. Separating these layers is archaeology's challenge and theology's dilemma. So what wisdom was lost when Peter the man became St. Peter the institution? What understanding disappeared beneath layers of tradition and political necessity? The historical Peter was probably far more Jewish than Christian tradition acknowledges. Early sources show him insisting that Jesus' followers should continue observing Jewish law, including dietary restrictions and circumcision. This Peter wasn't founding a new religion. He was leading a Jewish sect that believed the Messiah had come. The break between Christianity and Judaism happened gradually, probably more through Paul's influence than Peter's. Yet this tension is minimized in later traditions that needed Peter to be recognizably Christian in modern terms. Peter's papers, if he kept any, are completely lost. Any letters he actually wrote, any records of his teaching, any personal reflections, all vanished. What survives are documents written in his name or about him, always filtered through theological purposes. What did Peter actually believe about Jesus? How did he understand his own role? What were his doubts, his fears, his hopes? We'll never know. There's also lost wisdom in acknowledging uncertainty. Early Christians lived with ambiguity about their founders' lives. Later Christianity demanded certainty, creating detailed traditions that filled every gap. Perhaps the lost wisdom is accepting that foundational figures can be important without being fully known. That authority doesn't require perfect historical documentation. That faith can coexist with scholarly uncertainty about historical details. The deepest lost wisdom might be this: Peter's importance lay in his message, not his biography. By making biography essential to authority, Christianity trapped itself in historical questions it cannot definitively answer. Tradition holds that Peter died around 64 CE in Rome, crucified during Nero's persecution of Christians following the Great Fire. But as we've discovered, even this most basic fact about his death remains uncertain, built more on faith than evidence. So here we are, 2 millennia later, with Christianity built on foundations we cannot fully verify. Peter's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about history, tradition, and institutional authority. Can we separate the person from the legend? Should religious authority require historical proof? And what does it mean that so much of Christian tradition rests on claims that archaeology cannot confirm or deny? Peter's real legacy isn't the bones beneath the Vatican or the debates over where he died. It's the uncomfortable truth that all historical figures become what later generations need them to be. We build on rocks we've never fully examined. Perhaps the question isn't whether Peter was really in Rome, it's whether we're comfortable building our beliefs on foundations we cannot completely prove. What are we certain of, and what are we simply choosing to believe? Thank you very much for watching.